I first heard about the bargaining place when I was a kid. As usual, it was at a sleepover when I learned of this arcane knowledge. This was back in the Dark Ages when Fortnite was many years away. Our entertainment was ghost stories. As we huddled in our sleeping bags and told ghost stories by flashlight, Marvin, whose house it was, related a story he'd heard from the most reliable source, his older brother. If you go south past the town limits, the road eventually splits in two. At exactly 30 miles, there's a picnic area in between the lanes. If you stop there at 1 in the morning, you'll meet a stranger who will make a bargain with you. You'll get what you want if you turn around, go back into town, and do what you're asked. What does he want? I asked. It might not be a he who asks, answered Marvin. My brother says that Mike McAllister went out there last year and it was an old lady. He wanted to be on the varsity team and she told him to throw a brick through a church window. Did he do it? I demanded, curious about whether it really worked. Marvin shrugged. My brother didn't say, but he did say that Mike started on the varsity team this year. The conversation immediately turned to what we would ask for and what we were willing to do. Vandalism was certainly on the table, but we were divided on harming animals. It would depend on the animal, Marvin decided. All of us drew the line at killing someone, unless they really deserved it, or how badly we wanted that video game our parents said we weren't old enough to play. Since none of us knew how to get 30 miles out of town at 1 AM, the whole thing was moot, and we went on to other topics fervently discussed among 11-year-olds. As we got older, we would occasionally joke about going to make a bargain, usually when we needed to get out of trouble or had a test coming up. It was mainly a joke with our group, but I always wondered if it was true. I didn't want to be seen as the creepy kid, so I tried not to ask too many questions. I confirmed that Mike McAllister really was on the varsity basketball team and had an amazing season. I never could figure out if he really broke a church window with a brick, but I did hear about a church in town where that happened. I also knew exactly where the place was. Every time I was in the car and we drove south, I kept my eyes peeled for the place. It was exactly where Marvin said it would be, 13 miles from town and in between the north and south lanes. It looked creepy in the daytime, and my parents always sped up instinctively when we drove past it. I wish I could justify what happened next with a sad tale about my life falling apart, that what I did next was an act of desperation for a good cause. The truth is, my life was going pretty well. My friends and I were still close. My family was healthy and happy, and I was doing well in school. No, I just had to do it. I had to take the drive to that place and see if the story was true. I was 17 when I decided that I was finally going to see if this was true. Marvin was the only one of us who agreed to go with me. Everyone else was either too creeped out by the place or thought the idea was stupid. Marvin and I made our plans. I'd go to Marvin's house on a Friday night, and when everyone else was asleep, we'd take his dad's car and make the drive. Neither of us had cars, and his older brother was in college. We figured we could make the drive there and back without anyone being the wiser. The plan went off perfectly. Marvin's parents went to bed early and was sound asleep when we snuck out. His dad even left the keys hanging from a hook by the door. When we got into the car, it even had a full tank. Marvin and I was on the lookout for cops. None appeared, and we quickly drove out of town. As we drove, I could feel the place getting closer. I can't explain it, but I didn't need the mile markers to tell me when we'd gotten there, or that we were right on time. I didn't even wait for Marvin to turn the car off before I got out and headed straight into the center of the picnic area. Old trees surrounded a small, open area. 2 concrete picnic tables sat near each other, and there was a rusted grill nearby. I didn't spot any litter, and the trash barrel was conspicuously empty. As I walked up to the tables, the sound of the highway faded away, as did the sounds of crickets and other nocturnal wildlife. We heard a female sigh, and the night air around one of the tables parted like a curtain. A young woman with pale skin sat on the table, her feet resting on the bench. She wore what looked like a business suit I'd seen in a few 80s movies. Her skin was covered in dark, black veins, and her eyes were equally black. She looked at both of us, waiting for us to speak. "We've come to bargain," I told her, a line I'd rehearsed many times. She turned to Marvin and cocked her head. Marvin didn't say anything, but I heard him nervously nod, followed by a near silent stream of, "Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no." She held her hands out, and I figured she wanted to know our desires. I'd also prepared for this. "I want to know the truth about the afterlife. Is there life after death?" The woman nodded and looked at Marvin. "I want a car," Marvin stammered. The woman nodded again. She held out her left hand to me, wanting me to take it. As I walked up to her, I could smell smoke and metal and sweat. I've never smelled something like that before or since. I also saw that she was slightly transparent. If I looked hard enough, I could see the faint trace of the trees behind her. When I took her hand, I felt neither warmth nor cold, but instead a great pressure crushing my entire body. I saw a funeral, and I knew the date and time. I was to go there and speak to someone I once knew, a former teacher, and say a single word. The instruction was burned into my head, and I knew that if I did what I was asked, I would have my answer. The pressure let up, and the woman released my hand. I nearly collapsed, but I managed to stay standing and backed away. She held out her other hand to Marvin. He nervously approached her, taking much smaller steps and tentatively holding out his hand. She didn't move and waited for him to take her hand. I watched as she simply pressed her thumb lightly against the top of his hand. A moment later, she released him. Marvin did collapse. I helped him up and we backed away from the woman. She looked at us for a few more seconds before the night air closed around her, and she was gone. Marvin was too freaked out, so I drove us back to his house. He didn't say a word the entire drive. He didn't speak until we parked his dad's car exactly where we'd found it, made sure the seat was adjusted correctly, and put his keys back on the hook. Only when he was back in his room did Marvin start talking. "What did you get me into?" he demanded. "It's real," I told him, excited beyond belief. I didn't even register that he was upset or possibly traumatized. "Your brother was right." "What is wrong with you?" Marvin told me. He was shaking. That's when I noticed how upset he was. I'd never seen him this bothered. "That thing wants me to cut down one of the big shade trees in the park. It showed me when to do it, what axe to use, even what gloves to wear." "But you'll get a car," I said. "That's the bargain." "I'm not cutting down a tree, especially one from the park." Marvin was nearly shouting. I tried to calm him down. "Then don't do it," I said. "You don't have to. It's fine if you don't." "What did it tell you?" Marvin asked, I have to attend a funeral and talk to Mrs. Mallard, I told him. And? That's it, I told him. No one's getting hurt. You're not going to tell anyone, are you? I was suddenly nervous that Marvin would freak out and ruin my plans. Who'd believe me? He said, lying down. Just forget it. Let's pretend like it never happened. Just then, his mom opened the door and hissed at us to go to sleep. Marvin was grateful for the excuse not to talk about it. He eventually drifted off, but I barely slept a wink. I was too excited. The next morning, Marvin barely said anything to me, and I gave him his space. His dad gave me a ride home, and Marvin opted not to come along. The funeral was that afternoon at the First Methodist Church. Mrs. Mallard's husband had just died a few days ago from cancer. It was pretty sudden, and from what I know, by the time they caught it, there was nothing they could do. Before anyone knew it, he had died. She'd been my 5th grade teacher, so my parents insisted that I attend. I'd been reluctant to go, but now I couldn't wait. My parents thought it was some newfound sense of maturity, and I went with that. The service was packed. Mrs. Mallard was about the same age as my parents, but had been teaching for a while. There were a lot of former students at the service, including several of my classmates. She was well liked and one of my favourite teachers, so the turnout wasn't a surprise. Marvin wasn't there. I was relieved because I was afraid he'd try to talk me out of my plan or somehow sabotage it. The service was nice for a funeral. There was singing and people spoke about how great he was. There were some funny stories, and I was surprised that people actually laughed at a funeral. Even Mrs. Mallard cracked a smile. After the service, there was the reception. There was a long line of people waiting to talk to Mrs. Mallard. I was suddenly very nervous and made sure I was in the back of the line. I could see that she was holding back tears while smiling. As I inched closer, I considered if I really wanted to do this. Maybe Marvin had a point. At the same time, I'd come all this way. I needed to have my answer. I thought about how I could smoothly slip the word into a sentence. However, the closer I got, the more nervous I became. So, when I got to her, I shook her hand and just blurted it out. Diamondback. She jerked her hand back, and the look on her face will haunt me for the rest of my days. I've seen people cry. I've seen adults cry. But I've never seen someone look at me with such horror and despair and grief. The calm mask she'd been holding onto broke, and she just wailed in pain and crumpled to the ground. No, 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 was all she said. Immediately, everyone was looking at me, wanting to know how I'd hurt this sweet teacher at her husband's funeral. I was stunned and tried to back away. As soon as I began taking a step back, she sprang to her feet with such ferocity and grabbed my arms so tight I could feel my bones creak. How did you know that word? She demanded. Who told you? I shook my head. No one told me, I lied. It just came to me. A large crowd had gathered, and from the mood of the room, they were all certain that I was to blame. I figured I was already in trouble, so I decided to press it. What does it mean? I asked. It can't be, was all she said. You can't know that word. It can't be. She released me, and I was immediately pulled away by several older men who demanded to know what I'd said to her. I played dumb and told them I just said a word that popped into my head. I had no idea what it meant. They were very, very upset and decided the best thing was to just throw me out of the reception. I waited by my parents' car. My parents spent the next 15 minutes apologizing to everyone. I'm not sure it helped. As people left, they glared at me. Some shouted that I ought to be ashamed. Others made a point not to speak to me. I would have been more worried about the hit to my reputation if I didn't feel let down that I didn't get an answer to my question. I said the word. I fulfilled my side of the bargain. And yet, I had no answer. I caught hell on the drive home. It was the worst I'd ever been yelled at. They didn't even know what exactly I'd done to upset Mrs. Mallard, but they were sure I'd done something stupid and deserved the harangue. When we got home, I was banished to my room and grounded for a month. Naturally, I was the big story at school. All the teachers were mad at me and just looking for a reason to write me up. According to the rumour mill, I had said any number of horrible things to her. Marvin refused to even look at me. The rest of my friends asked me what I did, and I told them the truth. I had made a bargain, and this was my end of the deal. After I said that, it became clear that I wouldn't be eating lunch with them for a while. About a week later, Mrs. Mallard's sister came to visit. My parents were immediately apologetic and demanded I apologize. I stammered out a sincere-sounding apology. I was pretty good at them, and her sister asked to speak with me alone. As my parents left the room, they gave her a look that said, "Don't kill him, but do what you must." She didn't yell or get angry at all. As soon as my parents were out of earshot, she asked, "How did you know that word?" Before I could lie and say that it just came to me, she leaned in and hissed, "Did you make a bargain?" I felt a chill. I was so shocked I could only nod. "It's a small town," she told me. "Your friends talked and word got around." Having someone know my secret gave me my voice back. "What did the word mean?" I asked. Why was she so upset? Mrs. Mallard's sister was quiet. In his last days, Mark was pretty delirious, but my sister stayed at his side. She told me that he told her he would send her a message from beyond the grave. My sister humoured him, and they agreed on a code. If he wound up in a good place, heaven or something like that, he'd send her the word Blue Bonnet. But if he was in a bad place, he'd send a different word. Diamondback, I said. She nodded. We didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. She sat for a while longer and then showed herself out. I just went back up to my room. I stayed there for the rest of the day. I didn't even come down for dinner. I had my answer. The bargain had been fulfilled. All I had to do was tell one of my favourite teachers that her husband was in hell. Not just tell her, confirm it for her. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't that bad what I did. At least I didn't murder anyone. But deep down I knew that I had destroyed this woman. I'd also destroyed myself. I was just too young and stupid to realise it at the time. You might expect this part of the story to be when my life fell apart, but that's not what happened. Eventually, the town moved on from what I did, and my friends started speaking to me again. Even Marvin. I graduated, went to college, and fell into a pretty good career. But I was never happy. The older I got, the more I understood the terrible price of the bargain. I never married or had any serious relationship because I knew that if they died, there was a good chance they'd also end up in that bad place. I cut myself off, never getting close to anyone, never daring to care about someone who could suffer for eternity. Every day, I think about Mrs. Mallard and that look of anguish on her face. I hear her in my dreams. I have no idea how she could ever cope. I never tried looking her up for fear of what I'd find. I've done enough to her. Which is why I'm going to try fix it. I'm going back to make another bargain. I want to know if there's a way I can help her. This is a big ask, and while I don't know what the price will be, I don't expect to come back. If you're listening to this, I've already made the bargain. I set up this video to post the day after because I want people to know what happened. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm too far gone. I'm doing this for anyone who has ever thought about going to a place like that and making a bargain. Just don't. You will regret it for the rest of your life. And probably for a long time after that.